The wind had teeth and it was chewing on the world. It tore at the threadbare blanket, a thing of holes and memory, wrapped around the small shape huddled in the lee of a dead wagon. Snow, fine and sharp as ground glass, had already buried the broken wheel and was now building a soft, white tomb around a pair of boots too small for the cruelty of the season. Inside those boots, feeling had long since fled. A life was about to end. And another, though he did not know it, was about to begin. The child did not shiver anymore. That was the last stage, the quiet that came after the shaking stopped. She clutched a leather-bound book to her chest, its corners hard and cold against her ribs. Her eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in a slow surrender to the great, white silence. The world had faded to a low hum, the sound of blood leaving her ears. It was not so bad, this ending. It was just cold. Then a sound, a crunching, heavy and rhythmic, that did not belong to the wind. It grew closer. The child did not have the strength to open her eyes. The sound stopped. A shadow fell over her, a sudden blotting out of the gray, unforgiving light. The man stood over her for a long moment, his own breath pluming in the air like a ghost. He was on his way back from checking his trap lines, a grim ritual that rarely yielded more than disappointment these days. He carried a rifle in one hand and a profound weariness in his soul. He had come to this high, lonely place to be left alone by God and other men, and for 5 years, he had mostly gotten his wish. Section he saw the small mound in the snow, thought it was a coyote or a stray dog that had succumbed to the freeze. Then he saw the worn leather of a boot sole. His heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone, gave a hard, painful lurch. He knelt. He brushed the snow away from a face so pale, and still it looked like it was carved from porcelain. Blue lips, eyelashes crusted with ice. A girl, maybe 6 years old, maybe 7. It was hard to tell. She weighed nothing. A bird. A shadow. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible flutter of breath at her nostrils, a tiny miracle of defiance against the overwhelming cold. For the first time in a very long time, the man did not know what to do. His first instinct, the one honed by years of loss and bitterness, was to walk away. The world was full of sorrows, and this was not his. But his hands moved before his mind could stop them. He touched her cheek. The cold of her skin was terrible, a deep, lifeless cold that sank into his own calloused fingertips. He looked around at the vast, empty wilderness, at the accusing sky. He was the only thing standing between this child and the grave. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like a curse, that he could not let her die. Not here. Not like this. Before we go any further, before we step back into that biting wind and see what this man chooses to do, I want to take just a moment to speak to you directly. Stories like this, about finding light in the darkest of places, are why we are all here. If this is the kind of story that finds a home in your heart, I would be so grateful if you would consider subscribing to this channel. And I am always curious to know where these stories are landing. So, if you feel comfortable, please leave a comment telling me what city or country you are watching from. It is a genuine honor to share this time with you, and knowing you are out there makes all the difference. Thank you. Now, let us return to that lonely mountain, where a choice was about to be made that would change everything. The man worked with a grim efficiency that belied the turmoil in his chest. He unwrapped the thick wool blanket from his own bedroll, a precious thing he guarded against the cold, and gently, so very gently, bundled the child in its folds. She was limp, a doll filled with sawdust and ice. He lifted her. The weight of her was a shock. She was less than a memory, a whisper of a thing. He held her against his chest, trying to shield her from the wind with his own body, a body that had not offered comfort to another living soul in years. The walk back to his cabin was a mile of torment. Every step was a prayer and a curse. The wind howled, trying to rip her from his arms. The snow deepened, grabbing at his boots. He felt the terrible fragility of her in his arms, the slightness of her bones, and a rage began to smolder deep inside him. It was an old, familiar rage, one he had tried to bury under years of solitude and whiskey. A rage against a world that allowed this to happen, that allowed children to be left to freeze in the snow. He did not think. He just moved, one foot in front of the other. His own cold was a distant fact, unimportant. All that mattered was the small, cold weight in his arms. The cabin was a dark shape against the snow, a squat, stubborn testament to his own isolation. He kicked the door open, not bothering with the latch. The single room was frigid, the air inside barely warmer than the air outside. A fine layer of dust coated everything. The hearth was a black mouth full of cold ash. He laid her down on his cot, the only piece of soft furniture in the place. He piled his other blankets over her, rough, scratchy things that smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. They looked impossibly heavy on her small frame. He moved to the hearth, his hands shaking now, not from cold, but from something else. Adrenaline, fear. He worked with frantic haste, laying kindling, striking a match with a fumbling thumb. The flame caught, a tiny, struggling point of light in the gloom. He fed it, nurtured it, coaxed it into a small, crackling fire. It was a battle against the darkness, against the cold that had invaded his home, that had seeped into the very marrow of the child on his cot. He filled a pot with snow from the bucket by the door and hung it over the flames. Water. He needed to get warm liquid into her. He did not know much about medicine, but he knew about the cold. He had seen what it could do to men, to livestock. It stole the life from the inside out. He turned back to the cot. He needed to get the wet things off her. He hesitated, felt like a violation, touching this stranger, this child. But the hesitation lasted only a second. Her life depended on it. With hands that felt clumsy and huge, he carefully unlaced her frozen boots. Her feet were a terrifying shade of blue-white. He peeled away her thin socks, which were stiff with ice. He unbuttoned her coat, a flimsy thing that offered no real protection. Underneath, she wore a simple dress, also damp and cold. As he worked, he saw the bruises. Dark, ugly marks on her arms. A faded yellow-green shadow on her cheekbone. These were not the marks of a simple fall. This was the work of a hand. A cruel hand. The rage in his chest burned hotter. A clean, sharp flame. He wrapped her in the driest, warmest blanket he owned, tucking it around her small body. He sat by the cot, watching her, listening to the shallow whisper of her breath. The fire crackled and spat, slowly pushing the shadows back into the corners of the room. The snow in the pot began to melt, dripping slowly at first, then faster, until it was a pool of clear, cold water. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm in the vast, silent wilderness. He remembered another small chest, another shallow breath, a memory he had fought for 5 years to keep buried. His daughter, the fever that had taken her, the feeling of helplessness as he had watched her slip away, her small hand growing cool in his. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, he would not go back there. He would not. But the past did not care what he wanted. It was here, in this room, in the face of this frozen child. He had run to the end of the world to escape his ghosts, and they had found him anyway. The water in the pot was warm now. He ladled some into a tin cup. He knelt by the cot again. "Hey!" he said, his voice a rough, unused thing. It sounded like stones grinding together. "Hey, little one, you need to drink something." He gently lifted her head. Her neck was limp. He touched the rim of the cup to her blue lips. A little of the warm water trickled into her mouth. She did not respond. He tried again, a little more. A tiny, reflexive swallow. It was enough. It was a start. He spent the next hour like that, a patient, desperate vigil. A spoonful of warm water every few minutes. He rubbed her hands between his own, trying to force warmth back into them. They were so small, her fingers like twigs. He felt a terrible, aching tenderness that he had not allowed himself to feel for anyone, for anything, in a very long time. Slowly, miraculously, a change began. A faint touch of pink returned to her cheeks. A tremor ran through her body, a real shiver. It was a good sign. It meant her body was fighting. He pulled the blankets tighter around her. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace held. The fire burned steadily. The man did not move from his post beside the cot. He just watched. He was a guardian, a sentinel. It was a role he thought he had abandoned forever. Toward dawn, as the gray light began to seep through the single dirty window, her eyelids fluttered. They opened. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, washed-out blue. They were filled with a fear so profound it made his breath catch in his throat. She stared at him, at his bearded face, at the rough walls of the cabin. Her small body went rigid. She tried to scramble away, to push herself into the wall, a trapped animal looking for an escape. A tiny, hoarse sound escaped her lips, a whimper of pure terror. The man immediately backed away. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace he had not used in a decade. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer than before, trying to sand the edges off the gravel. "Easy. You are safe here." She just stared, her eyes wide, tracking his every move. He saw himself through her eyes. A large, unkempt stranger in a dark, strange place. A monster. He sat down on the floor, deliberately making himself smaller, less threatening. He kept his hands in plain sight. He did not look directly at her, but off to the side, at the fire. "The storm is a bad one," he said, speaking to the flames. "But you are warm in here. There is a fire." He kept his tone low and steady, a gentle murmur. "Nobody is going to hurt you here." He did not know if she understood him. He did not know if she could even speak. But he kept talking, filling the silence with the calm, even cadence of his voice. He talked about the snow, about the way the pines held their branches under the weight of it. He talked about the deer that sometimes came to the edge of his clearing in the mornings. Simple things, safe things. After a long time, the rigidity in her small body seemed to lessen. She was still watching him, wary and silent, but the sheer, animal panic had subsided. She was assessing him. Hunger. She must be starving. He had a little dry jerky and half a loaf of stale bread. It was not much, but it was all he had. He moved slowly, deliberately, so as not to startle her. He took a piece of the bread, broke off a small corner, and placed it on the small crate that served as his table, near the edge of the cot. Then he backed away again, returning to his spot on the floor by the fire. He did not look at her. He gave her the dignity of her own choice. He listened. For a long time, there was only the sound of the fire and the wind. Then he heard a faint rustle of blankets. A tiny, hesitant movement. He heard the scrape of the bread against the wood of the crate. He risked a glance. She had reached out a thin, trembling hand and taken the piece of bread. She was holding it, looking at it, as if she did not know what it was. Then, she brought it to her mouth and took a small, cautious bite. She chewed slowly, deliberately, and then she began to cry. They were not loud, dramatic sobs. They were silent, heartbreaking tears that streamed down her pale cheeks. She kept eating the bread, bite by tiny bite, as the tears flowed. It was the crying of a child who had learned long ago that making noise was dangerous. The man's heart broke. It was a clean break, a sharp, painful split right down the middle of the stone he had built around it. He wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he knew it would only frighten her more. So he stayed where he was, on the floor by the fire, and he let her cry. He bore witness to her sorrow. It was the only thing he could do. When she had finished the small piece of bread, she looked at him. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. It was an old gaze in a young face. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Her voice was a tiny, fragile thing, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across ice. The formality of it, the "sir," struck him like a physical blow. Children did not talk like that, not unless they had been taught to be invisible, to be polite, to appease. "You are welcome," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "There is more, if you are still hungry." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, her small hands clutching the edge. The leather-bound book she had been holding when he found her was on the cot beside her. Her fingers brushed against its cover. "You got a name, little one?" he asked gently. She hesitated for a long moment. "They called me Lily," she said, her voice barely audible. "Lily," he repeated. The name felt strange and beautiful in the grimy cabin. A flower in the middle of a frozen wasteland. "That is a good name." He saw her gaze drift toward the door, toward the sound of the howling wind. A flicker of fear crossed her face. "Is he coming?" she asked, her whisper sharp with dread. The man's blood ran cold. He asked, keeping his voice level. "Who is that, Lily?" She flinched at the sound of her own name, as if she was not used to hearing it spoken with kindness. "The man," she said. "The man with the shiny boots. Mama said we had to run. She said he would find us. A man with shiny boots. In this part of the country that meant money. It meant power. It meant someone who did not belong to the mountains, but who thought he owned them." "What happened to your mama?" he asked, his voice low. Lily's face crumpled again, but the tears did not come this time. Her expression went strangely blank, a careful, practiced emptiness. "She fell," she said, her voice flat. "The wagon went over. She told me to run. To take the book and run and not look back." She clutched the leather book tighter. She said to find the man who used to wear a star. She said he would know what to do." The man felt the air leave his lungs. A star. A tin star. A life he had shed like a snake's skin. A life he had burned and buried. He had been a lawman once, in a town 100 miles and a lifetime away. A town run by a man who wore shiny boots. A man who bought and sold lives like cattle. A man whose corruption had cost him everything. His job. His reputation. His wife. He looked at the child, at her wide, terrified eyes, and he understood. This was not a random tragedy. This was not a simple accident. This was a message. A ghost from his past had reached out and found him in his exile. "Lily," he said, and his voice was a different thing now, harder, colder. "The book. What is in the book?" She looked down at the ledger in her hands. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of names and numbers. It was a record, a meticulous accounting of stolen goods, of bribes paid, of men who had disappeared. It was the evidence he had spent a year trying to find, the proof that could have brought the whole rotten empire crashing down. The proof that had vanished the same week his wife had died in a sudden, unexplained fire. He stood up. He walked to the cot and knelt beside it. This time she did not flinch. She looked at him, her gaze searching his face. "You are him, ain't you?" she whispered. "You are the man who wore the star." He could not speak. He could only nod. The past was not dead. It was not even past. It was here, in his cabin, small and shivering and holding the truth in its hands. He had run from this fight once, broken and defeated. He had hidden himself away, content to let the world rot. But the fight had come looking for him. He reached out and, with a gentleness that surprised him, he placed his large, calloused hand over her small one on the cover of the book. It was a promise, a silent vow. The rage he felt was no longer a wild, unfocused thing. It was cold now. It was sharp. It had a name and a face. And it had a purpose. His isolation was over. The man who had come to the mountains to die had just been given a reason to live. Over the next few days, a quiet routine settled over the cabin. The storm blew itself out, leaving the world buried under a blanket of pristine, silent white. The man and the child existed in a small bubble of warmth and stillness. He taught her how to bank the fire, how to melt snow for water. She watched him with those old, solemn eyes, absorbing everything. She spoke very little, and when she did, it was in fragments, small pieces of a shattered story. She talked about her mother, about her soft hands and the songs she used to sing. She talked about always being hungry, always moving. She spoke of the man with the shiny boots as if he were a folktale monster, a creature from a dark story, a man named Mr. Blackwood. The name hit the man like a physical blow. Mr. Blackwood, the architect of his ruin, the man who owned the town, the bank, the sheriff, the man whose smiling face hid a soul as black as a pit. He had thought he was free of that name, that he had put enough miles and enough years between himself and that poison. But it had found him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lily was tracing the patterns in the wood grain of the floor. "Mama said you were a good man," she said, not looking at him. "She said you were the only one who was not afraid of him." "Your mama knew me?" he asked, his voice tight. "She worked for him," Lily whispered. "In his big house. She cleaned the rooms. She saw things. She wrote them down, she tapped the ledger beside her. She said the numbers were his sins. She said they would set everyone free." He now understood the woman's sacrifice. She had not just been running for her life. She had been on a mission. She had entrusted her daughter, her only treasure, with the one weapon that could destroy the monster that haunted them all. And she had sent her to him. It was an act of desperate, unbelievable faith. Faith in a man who had lost all faith in himself. He felt a profound sense of shame. He had mourned his own losses, nursed his own grievances, and retreated from the world. While he had been hiding, this woman had been fighting. She had paid the ultimate price, believing he would finish the job. That night, after Lily had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on the cot, the man did something he had not done in 5 years. He opened the old, locked trunk at the foot of his bed. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten blankets, was his past. A faded photograph of a woman with a kind smile. His wife. And beside it, a gun belt, coiled like a sleeping snake. The holster was worn, the leather supple from years of use. The pistol was heavy and cold, its metal gleaming dully in the firelight. He lifted the gun from its holster. It felt familiar in his hand, an extension of his own will. He checked the action. It was clean, well-oiled. He had never neglected his tools. He had just forgotten how to use them. He looked from the gun in his hand to the sleeping child on the cot. Her face was peaceful in sleep, the lines of fear and worry erased for a few precious hours. She was so small, so vulnerable, and yet she had survived. She had walked through the valley of the shadow and had not surrendered. She had carried the truth through a blizzard. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The bitterness that had been his constant companion for 5 years began to dissolve, replaced by a fierce, cold clarity. His grief had been a wall, shutting him off from the world. Now it was becoming a weapon. The memory of his wife, of his daughter, was no longer just a source of pain. It was fuel. He was not just protecting this child. He was avenging them all. The woman who died on the road. The child who had lost everything. His wife who had been stolen from him. He was the man who used to wear a star. And it was time to remember what that meant. It did not just mean enforcing the law. It meant standing between the innocent and the darkness. He knew they would come looking for the book. Blackwood was not a man to leave loose ends. He would send his hounds. Men with cold eyes and no conscience. The man in the black coat. The man with the scar. He remembered them. They were the instruments of Blackwood's will. The cabin, once his sanctuary of isolation, was now a fortress. Target. He had to be ready. The next morning he took Lily outside. The world was blindingly bright. The snow was deep, unbroken. He taught her how to read the tracks in the snow. Rabbit, deer, fox. And these, he said, pointing to a set of older tracks nearly covered by the fresh fall. Wolf. Are they dangerous? She asked, her eyes wide. Everything out here is dangerous if you do not respect it, he said. But wolves are smart. They mostly keep to themselves. It is the two-legged predators you have to worry about. He began to prepare. He chopped a mountain of firewood, stacking it against the cabin wall. He checked his supply of ammunition. It was low. He would have to be careful with his shots. He reinforced the door, adding a heavy wooden bar. He boarded up most of the single window, leaving only a small slit to see and shoot through. Lily watched him, her expression unreadable. She did not ask questions. She seemed to understand, in a way no child should, that they were preparing for a war. She helped in her own small way, stacking kindling, keeping the water pot full. She was a quiet, efficient shadow at his side. One afternoon, he was cleaning his rifle by the fire when she spoke. "Are they going to kill us?" she asked, her voice a small, matter-of-fact whisper. The question was so direct, so devoid of childish fear, that it stopped him cold. He looked at her. She was not crying. She was simply asking for information. She was a soldier assessing a threat. He put down his rifle. He looked her straight in the eye. "They are going to try," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I am not going to let them. Do you understand me, Lily?" She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. A single, sharp nod. "I am not going to let anyone hurt you ever again," he said. It was more than a promise. It was a declaration, an oath sworn in a dusty cabin at the top of the world. A few days later, his supplies ran low. He needed flour, salt, and more ammunition. That meant a trip to the settlement, a small, dreary collection of buildings a half-day's ride away. He hated the thought of leaving Lily alone, but he had no choice. "I have to go to town," he told her. "I will be back before nightfall." Fear flared in her eyes. "Do not leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I will not be long," he said, kneeling down in front of her. "I want you to stay inside. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone. Not for anyone but me. Can you do that?" She nodded, biting her lip. "I will come back," he said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "I promise." The ride to the settlement was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He scanned the trees, the ridges, looking for any sign of movement. The world felt different now. It was no longer just an empty landscape. It was a hunting ground. The settlement was as he remembered it. A handful of sullen buildings sinking into the mud and snow. The general store was run by an old man, a weary but decent fellow who mostly kept to himself. As the man tied his horse to the rail, he saw them. 2 horses, expensive-looking, stood outside the saloon. They were not local animals. And standing by them were 2 men. One wore a long, black coat that seemed to suck the light out of the air around him. The other had a livid scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. Blackwood's hounds. His hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip. He forced himself to relax. He could not afford a confrontation here. Not yet. He had to get what he needed and get back to Lily. He walked into the general store. The old proprietor looked up, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. He had not seen the mountain man in months. "Need supplies," the man said, his voice low. He gathered what he needed quickly, his senses on high alert. He could feel the presence of the 2 men across the street like a change in the weather. They had not seen him yet. As the proprietor was bagging his goods, he leaned in close. "There has been talk," the old man murmured, not meeting his eye. "Mr. Blackwood has men up here, looking for something. Something that was lost in a wagon crash." "I ain't heard anything," the man said, his face a mask of indifference. "Be careful," the old man whispered, pushing the bag across the counter. "These are not good men." "There ain't many of those left," the man replied. He paid for his supplies and walked back out into the cold air. The 2 men were still there. The man with the scar was looking his way. Their eyes met across the muddy street. There was no recognition in the henchman's eyes, just a casual, predatory assessment. The man forced himself to look away, to mount his horse, to ride out of the settlement at a steady, unhurried pace. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel their eyes on him. He knew they would follow. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they were here. They were hunting, and he and the child were the prey. The ride back was a race against the setting sun and the rising tide of his own fear, not for himself, but for the little girl waiting for him in the cabin. the little girl to whom he had made a promise. When he saw the thin curl of smoke rising from his chimney against the purple twilight sky, a profound sense of relief washed over him. He spurred his horse the last few hundred yards. He dismounted and went to the door. "Lily," he called out. "It is me." He heard the sound of the heavy bar being lifted from the inside. The door creaked open. She stood there, her small face pale in the dim light. He stepped inside and she immediately barred the door behind him. She did not say anything, but she stayed close to him as he unloaded the supplies. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not peaceful. It was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. They were no longer just hiding. They were waiting. Lily fell asleep by the fire, the ledger clutched in her arms like a teddy bear. The man sat in the single chair, his rifle across his lap, watching her. He looked at her innocent face, at the way her chest rose and fell with each steady breath. He had thought his capacity for love had died with his family. He had been wrong. It had not died. It had only been sleeping, and this small, broken child had awakened it. It was a fierce, terrifying love, a protective instinct so powerful it felt like it might burn him up from the inside. He would not let them have her. He would not let Blackwood's darkness touch her. He would become a wall of fire. He would become a mountain. He would stand between her and all the evil in the world. He looked down at his hands. They were rough, calloused, scarred. They were the hands of a man who had built a life and then torn it down. They were the hands that had held his dying wife, that had dug his daughter's grave. Now they were the hands that would hold a rifle. They were the hands that would defend a life. He remembered something his own father had told him long ago. A man ain't measured by what he runs from. He is measured by what he is willing to stand and fight for. For 5 years he had been running. Now he was done running. He knew the coming fight would likely be his last. Blackwood had money and men and the law in his pocket. He had a cabin, a rifle, and a little girl to protect. The odds were impossible. He knew that. But as he looked at Lily, sleeping soundly in the warm glow of the fire, he also knew that he did not care. Some things were worth dying for, and some things were worth living for. He had found both in this small, silent child. The next day passed in a state of heightened awareness. Every snap of a twig outside, every moan of the wind, sent a jolt through him. He sat by the boarded window, watching the snow-covered clearing, his rifle never far from his hand. Lily seemed to sense the change in him. She was quieter than usual, moving about the cabin with a careful grace. She took the ledger and tucked it into a loose stone in the hearth, hiding it away. It was her own idea. She was a survivor. In the late afternoon, she came and sat on the floor beside his chair. She did not speak for a long time. He did not press her. He had learned that her silences were as meaningful as her words. "Will you still be here?" she finally asked. Her voice so quiet he almost did not hear it. "When I open my eyes in the morning." The question was a knife to his heart. It was the question of a child who had known nothing but abandonment, nothing but loss. It was the question of a child who had woken up too many mornings to find herself alone. He put his rifle down. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the faint smudges of dirt on her cheeks, the way her hair was matted in the back, the deep, soul-weary sadness in her eyes. And he saw the flicker of hope she was trying so hard to hide. "Lily," he said, and his voice was raw with an emotion he could no longer contain. "Look at me." She lifted her gaze to meet his. "I will be here when you wake up in the morning," he said, his voice low and certain. "And the morning after that. And the morning after that. I am not going anywhere. Do you hear me?" A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She nodded. "I promise," he said. He had not made a real promise to another human being in 5 years. The word felt heavy, sacred. "On my life. I promise." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she leaned her head against his knee. It was a small, tentative gesture of trust, but to him it felt like the shifting of the entire world. He rested his hand on her head, his fingers stroking her tangled hair. He sat like that for a long time, a statue of newfound purpose, a guardian at his post. That night he made a decision. Waiting for them to come was a fool's game. They had the numbers. They could lay siege, wait him out. He had to take the fight to them. He had to change the rules. After Lily was asleep, he went to the locked trunk again. He took out the gun belt and strapped it around his waist. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. A part of him he thought was long dead had come back to life. He went to the small, cracked mirror he had nailed to the wall. He looked at his reflection. He saw a stranger, a wild man with a tangled beard and haunted eyes. But underneath the grief and the grime, he could see the man he used to be, the man who wore a star, the man who did not back down. He took a bottle of whiskey from the shelf, the last of his supply. For 5 years it had been his only companion, the medicine he used to dull the pain. He looked at it, then at the sleeping child. He walked to the door, opened it, and poured the contents of the bottle out onto the snow. The harsh smell filled the air for a moment, then was gone. He was done dulling the pain. He needed it now. He needed it to be sharp. He stood on his porch, looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. The cold air was clean and sharp in his lungs. The mountains stood as silent, ancient witnesses. He was one man against an empire. It was madness. It was suicide. And it was the only thing to do. He would not wait for the wolves to come to his door. He would go out and hunt them himself. He would take back the truth. He would honor the faith of the woman who had died to bring it to him. He would keep his promise to the child who was now his reason for breathing. He went back inside, quietly closing the door. He did not go to his own empty bed. Instead, he pulled the chair close to the cot where Lily slept. He sat down, his rifle resting against his knee, and he watched over her. The firelight danced across her face. She looked peaceful. She looked safe. The battle was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the stillness of the night. The darkness was gathering. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid. He had something to protect. He had a purpose. The man on the mountain was no longer hiding. He was waiting, and he was ready.